had a Shabbos, and we wish each other a good week. Shavua Tov, or in Yiddish, a good Vach. It's nice to be with you, my friends. Let me get the video in front of me. Okay. Can I? I cannot. Thought I might just share this into my personal news feed. I never do that, but maybe some other people will see it who would like to see it, so I'm going to do that. Share now. Okay. And here we go, over on the YouTube side. Beautiful. All right. Who's with us? Who is in the house? Let us see. I see Sharon Frant Brooks says Shavua Tov from rainy Lebanon, New Jersey. Welcome, Sharon. Good to see you. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. We'd love to know who's with us, who is joining us on a Saturday evening. As we get towards summer, when I come out of Shabbos, I have to, take notes and get ready to teach. So unfortunately, I have to go a little bit late on Saturday nights. And the latest is going to be around the middle of June, right? So that's when we reach the longest days of the year, and Shabbat ends the latest. And then after that, it starts becoming a little bit earlier every week. It's always strange to watch the days begin to start shortening just incrementally, little by little. They get a little bit shorter from June on. Even though we're heading into the midst of summer, the days are already shortening. And we barely even notice it. But it's a nice reminder that when we get to December and the days get the shortest day in December, and then they start to lengthen even as we head into the depth of winter in January or February, it's a beautiful and hopeful thought that God has already taken care of us, that the days are starting to lengthen and we're headed back to the rejuvenation of spring and the warmth, etc. All right. Let's see. David Salmon says a good vach. Rochelle Rosen says Shavua Tov and Hag Hodesh. We're going to be celebrating Rosh Hodesh Sivan. Begins tomorrow night. It's so beautiful. The first of Sivan, Rosh Hodesh Sivan. And that means that we're almost at Shavuos. So Shavuos is going to begin Thursday night. That's when we finish counting the 50 days of the Omer. From the second night of Passover, we count until the revelation at Mount Sinai, called Shavuos. And then we read the book of Ruth. I think we're going to have a public reading of the book of Ruth on probably Thursday during the day, right before Shavuos. And then we're going to celebrate the most magnificent moment in human history when God appeared to 2 million people at Mount Sinai and gave the 10 Commandments. Let's see. Paula Schmidt-Klauser is in from Chicago. Timothy Wheeler says, thank you. Paul Kunis says, Shavua Tov. Janice says, Shavua Tov. Greg Schneider is in the house from Santa Clara, California. Lucy Johnson says, it's almost midnight here. Hello from Minnesota. Ann Dodge Schwann says, hi from San Diego. Timothy is talking about the solstice, the summer solstice, beautiful. Dina Tsar is in the house from the Negev, I believe, in Israel. Mendy Margolin is with us. Jonathan Hoy says, hello from Texas. It's almost midnight here. Dan K. Miller-Gartner has joined. And Timothy Wheeler says, thank you for the update. Beautiful. It's great to be with you. Let's get right into the teaching. And if you have questions, as always, I will take comments and questions at the end of the teaching. So we're in Tractate Shabbos, Masechet Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. Today we're looking at page 78, Daf 78. We're going to be, and that's Ayin Chet, and what do I want to say? And we're doing chapter 8, which we opened yesterday with the first Mishnah of chapter 8. Today we're going to wrap up that first Mishnah, which is about the minimum measure of liquids, that if one is carrying that much of a liquid, carrying it out on Shabbos from a private domain to a public domain, he becomes liable to bring the sin offering, assuming, of course, that he did that, he violated the prohibition on carrying unwittingly. If he did it intentionally, then he can't bring the sin offering to atone. Then it's a different punishment, as it were, at the hands of heaven. And today we'll get into Mishnah number 2, which is the minimum measure of certain objects, which render one liable to bring the sin offering if he unwittingly carries them on Shabbos. So, to wrap up our discussion of the first Mishnah about the minimum measure of liquids, Abaye observes about the liquid. So we saw that the minimum measure for wine was a quarter of a quarter lug, right? So a quarter lug is called a revi'is, and a quarter of that is the amount of undiluted wine that when it's diluted, because in the ancient world, wine was much stronger than it is now. They didn't, it was like cask strength wine, as it were, and they wouldn't drink pure wine by itself. They would have to dilute it. How much would they dilute it? It would be 3 parts water, 1 part wine, so in other words, 4 to 1. And so it's a quarter of the amount of wine that you would need once diluted so that you could have a proper cup of blessing. So Abaye is observing with regard to wine, the minimum measure has to do with the amount that we drink. With regard to milk, the minimum measure to render you liable for carrying it out unwittingly on Shabbos was a gulp, right? A gulp of wine. With regard to honey, which is used both for eating and for medical purposes to put on a sore, we used the measure for putting it on a sore, the medical usage, which is a smaller amount. And with regard to, what was it, for example, oil, which we eat, but we took the amount that we'd use to anoint the small limb of a child. And what was the small limb of a child? That was just the toe of a little child, right? It just said the small limb, the amount of oil necessary to anoint a small limb. What's a small limb? Like the toe of a child. That's how little you need in terms of oil. So Abaye observes that where these liquids have both a common usage and an uncommon usage, so the sages would determine the liability, for the minimum measure for liability, based on the common usage, even if that resulted in even in a leniency, right? Because wine is occasionally used for healing, but that's quite uncommon. Drinking is the much more common usage. When it's used for healing, like there's some situations where you might put wine on a bandage, much smaller amount is used on the bandage. But because that's uncommon, the sages use the amount that's for drinking as the minimum measure, and that creates a leniency because you won't be liable to bring the sin offering unless you have as much as you would need, to have a cup of blessing, right? You wouldn't be liable until you had about a quarter of a quarter lug of undiluted wine, so that would be a quarter of a volume that's equal to about an egg and a half of volume, right? So the point is, that's a greater volume than you would use in a medical situation, so this is a leniency. We're only going to become liable if we have the greater volume of wine on us when we carry it out on Shabbos. So in the common and uncommon usage, the sages use the common usage even though it results in a leniency. When a substance like honey has usages for eating and for medical that are both common, honey is commonly used both to eat it and in this medical usage to rub on a sore from chafing. And we saw in the comments on yesterday's class that people still use honey in quite a few contexts for healing. So it's commonly used both for eating and for medical usage. So therefore, the sages then look at the medical usage to establish the minimum measure, which creates a stringency as opposed to a leniency, meaning you're going to become liable to bring the sin offering even for the much smaller amount, the dollop of honey that we'd use to rub on a sore, which is less than whatever would be considered the minimum measure for a significant amount of honey in eating context. I don't know, perhaps a dollop of honey that we'd add to a cup of tea or some other use like that. I don't know what the minimum measure for eating honey would be, but we don't use it. We use a much smaller measure for the medical situation. So in light of this, so Abaye is saying, in light of the fact that when it has common and uncommon usage, we use the common usage even if it creates a leniency. When it has both a common usage and a common usage, drink for eating and for medical use, then we will go to the more stringent use, to the smaller measure which creates a stringency to protect people from violating Shabbos. So given that that's the situation, says Abaye, why in the case of water do we say that the minimum measure to become liable to bring a sin offering for taking some water out on Shabbos is the use of water in an eye bandage, which is a very small amount of water? Water is so much more commonly used as a drink. It's rare that people use water for its medicinal property of putting it on a bandage on someone's eye. It should have been that the minimum measure for carrying out water is in its use as a drink, and like all other liquids, it should have been the revi'is. I'm not sure I pronounce it exactly right, but the revi'is, a revis. Some people just say a revis, some people say a revi'is. But at any rate, a quarter lug. A quarter lug is the standard volume to become liable for carrying a liquid out that one drinks. Why is it that water, we use its minimum measure as that medical stringency of applying it to an eye bandage? The answer that is given, according to, and who is it that says so? Let me just check. We always want to give credit. When we give a teaching in the name of the one who originally gave the teaching, it's considered a beautiful thing. It's good for the one who originally taught, and it's good for us. It's good for all people to cite the name of the teacher. So in this case, the one who asks, right, well, Abaye asked the question, and then Abaye gives the answer. And he says that the reason that we go with the eye bandage is that they taught this law in the Galilee, where they typically drink wine. So Abaye is telling us that up in the Galilee, they drink wine like water, at least back then, right? They drank so much wine that wine was like a more common drink for them than water. And water, because they drank so much wine, their eyes were often red, and they needed those eye bandages, and that's what they would use the water for. They drink wine like water, it makes their eyes red, and then they would have to put a little bit of water in an eye bandage to help their red eyes. And Shmuel adds that you can use other liquids in an eye bandage, but water is much better because it's pure and it doesn't cloud your vision when you use it in the eye bandage. To finish up our discussion of this first Mishnah, we have a little bit of a dispute between the sages and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says that all of these minimum measures of liquids apply to a person who stores something. So what he's saying is, this is the minimum measure for us to deem that that amount of liquid is significant, that it has significance. Less than the minimum measure, it's insignificant, and we don't want you to be liable to bring a sin offering for carrying something on Shabbos which is insignificant. But if a person, for whatever reason, stores something, right, that when he has a little bit left over, like let's say a little bit of wine left over, which is less than what we're now saying is the minimum measure, a quarter of a quarter lug. But if this person stores that little bit of amount, he's saying that to him it's significant enough that he stores it, he keeps it, he doesn't just throw it out. So for him, we would say, the sages say that if he carries an amount that's significant enough for him to store it, so then he's liable to bring a sin offering. Rabbi Shimon says that even for people who store these little amounts, they're not going to become liable to bring the sin offering except in the minimum measures that are listed in the Mishnah. But the sages disagree with Rabbi Shimon, and they say that someone who stores something, that makes it significant. If he carries out that, even if it's less than the minimum measure for other people, for him, it's going to render him liable to bring the sin offering. And that wraps up our discussion of the Gemaras on the first Mishnah of chapter 8. And now we move on, to our discussion of the second Mishnah. So the second Mishnah is going to be about objects, the minimum size or the minimum amount of certain objects as opposed to liquids in the first Mishnah, which are going to render you liable for carrying them on Shabbos from one domain to another or more than 4 cubits in the public domain. So, what are these objects? If you're carrying some rope, if you have less rope than the amount that you would need to make a handle for a basket, so then that rope is insignificant, you're not going to be liable. Reed grass. Reed grass, the minimum measure to be deemed significant is enough to make a handle for a sifter or a sieve, which is a smaller object than a basket. Rabbi Yehuda says reed grass is actually used also for measuring the size of a child's foot, right? So in the old days, perhaps you were gonna go buy some sandals for your child, and you couldn't take the child with you. So you just take a piece of reed grass, measure it to the length of the child's foot, and you take that to the sandal maker. So that amount of reed grass is going to be significant. Again, like how big is a child's foot? I mean, obviously children have different size feet at different ages. And so again, we're finding here that there's a personalization of these amounts. Just like if something is significant for a person, so he stores it, that's significant enough to render him liable. Here, the reed grass could be the size of the child's foot. With regards to paper, how much paper do you have to carry in order to make that paper be a significant object, which would make you liable to bring the sin offering if you were carrying it? And of course, it bears saying one more time, this all applies in a community where there's no Eruv, right? They have not constructed a kind of legal boundary around a neighborhood or a city that would make it, legally speaking, as if everybody shared a courtyard. When there's no Eruv, once you leave your private property, so now you're out in the public domain, and you become liable if you're carrying something when you go from the private domain to the public domain. So in terms of paper, the minimum size is the size of a tax receipt. And we're going to talk about how big that is. The sages also say, so for paper, you're liable if you carry a paper that's large enough for it to be a tax receipt. And if you're carrying a tax receipt, you're liable. That sounds redundant. Why does it need to be said? If you have paper the size of a tax receipt, you're liable. And if you're carrying the tax receipt, isn't the tax receipt the size of a paper carrying a tax receipt? What they're saying there is, and if you're carrying something which is made out of parchment or hide, which would actually have to be larger in order to be significant enough to reach the minimum measure, but it was used as a tax receipt, so now you're liable because you're carrying the tax receipt. If a piece of paper had been written on and then erased, in other words, scratched out, it's not like they had lead pencils and then they would have nice pink erasers. When they say erased, it means something was written and then somebody came along and sanded it off or filed it off or scratched it off, removed the ink. And then they would say that that piece of paper is no longer useful. Something that had been written on and erased is not usable anymore for writing. So now we would say that piece of paper is going to be significant if it is large enough to wrap a small jar of perfume, right? It would have a different use, either to close the top of the perfume or to wrap the small jar of perfume. With regard to parchment, the minimum size, unless it became a tax receipt, otherwise the minimum size is enough to write the passage from the Torah of the Shema, the declaration of God's unity. These are small parchments which, once the Shema is written on them, they get rolled up and inserted into tefillin. And so that amount of parchment is the sort of smallest parchment that is deemed significant. eyeshadow. You can wear eyeshadow, but if you're carrying eyeshadow, right, you haven't applied it yet, how much is significant? Enough to paint one eye. That's pretty small. Glue. How much glue is significant? Enough to spread on the top of a post in order to catch a bird. I thought that was interesting. So they had glue traps to catch birds. What were they using the birds for? You know, they used doves to bring as sacrifices. Maybe they were catching birds to eat. Maybe they were catching birds to use as bait. Maybe, I don't know. But enough glue to catch a bird on top of a post. And there's a few other objects that have minimum measures as well. Let's talk for a moment about this paper that's going to be used as a tax receipt. So how big is that? How big is a paper that's going to be used as a tax receipt? Ask the sages. And the answer is it's enough to write 2 letters on it. But they note that this is larger than a paper that would contain 2 Hebrew letters. What language are they talking about? Greek, right? So they're talking about that these tax receipts are often written in Greek, which in handwriting terms is a little bit larger. 2 Greek letters handwritten would be larger, generally speaking, than 2 Hebrew letters. And it's interesting because the sages are living in a time and operating in a time when Rome is the dominant power. Why are they talking about Greek letters? Because this law, originally came into being a little bit earlier, right? So if you think about the Second Temple period, about 200 before the Common Era, that is when the revolt happened, the Maccabean revolt, which is the Hanukkah story, and that was against the Greek Empire, against the Greek civilization. So the tax collectors were collecting taxes in the Holy Land for the benefit of the Greek Empire. And that's why these Greek letters came to be the measure of the minimum size of a piece of paper to deem it significant. The sages, in another place in the Talmud, in a Tosefta, say the tax receipt, if it's the tax receipt itself, not just a piece of paper that's the size of a tax receipt, but the tax receipt itself, if he's carrying it before he has shown that receipt to a tax collector, okay, so then it's very significant to him. And if he's carrying it on Shabbos, he's liable to bring a sin offering for violating Shabbos. But after he has shown it to the tax collector, then it's no longer significant to him. It doesn't mean anything. He just happened to have it. He forgot it was in his pocket. Now it's an insignificant thing, and therefore it's not going to render him liable to bring the sin offering. But Rabbi Yehuda says, what are you talking about? Even after he shows it to a tax collector, that still remains a meaningful document. Why? Because he might have to show it to another tax collector. He might have to show it to the tax collector's superior or the tax collector's, junior, like his runner, his assistant, some other person who might come and say to him, hey, have you paid your taxes? And this gives us a little bit of an insight into what the world was like back then. The government authority was like much less organized and with much less communication from the center out to the people doing the job than now, right? I mean, this is a time not only before the internet and before telephones and before a postal system. I mean, it was just a completely different type of time, right? There was some kind of a postal system, but even that was often private, or you would use messengers. And tax collectors were often private individuals who bid for and received the franchise of being the tax collector for a bridge or outside a market. Taxes were often collected in the form of tariffs, right? And these people could be very dodgy, very corrupt, really take advantage of their situation. And that's why we have certain stories. I forget, we ran into one sage whose father was a tax collector. It might have been Rabbi Yochanan, but who was very, very honest about it and would go out of his way to make sure that the taxes were enforced fairly and that he himself was never enriched by the job of tax collecting. we hear that story because, of course, he was the exception. Very often these tax collectors were people that were really problematic for the population, especially when you're talking about the Jewish population in Judea being taxed by non-Jews who are representatives of a Greek government or a Roman government, etc. So the point is, you would want to keep that tax receipt so that you could prove that you had paid your taxes. You would keep that tax receipt to say, I am a man who pays his taxes. That's what Rabbi Yehuda is teaching us. And it's a good lesson for us, right? Some people can be lax with their record keeping, right? Some people can be lax with keeping their bills, and you don't have to overdo it. You don't want to be a hoarder who keeps everything, but you want to have a written record of your finances, because you never know. You never know. You may have to demonstrate at some point from your tax return or from your receipts of things. You should keep, it's a religious and holy practice to keep proper records of your finances, especially your taxes. Isn't that interesting that we're finding that here? We're learning all about the holiness of Shabbos and what you carry and don't carry, but now we're being told, be meticulous with your record. Don't overdo it. Don't be ridiculous. Don't be an obsessive compulsive, but keep proper records so that you can demonstrate, hey, I am a man who pays his taxes. Obeying the law of the land, being an upright person who is viewed as somebody who obeys the law of the land, our sages place a premium on that. There's a value on that, of being a demonstrably law-abiding citizen. And it makes sense. That's what I've got for us today. Let's review the comments and questions. Bill Eldridge says, one of the reasons the publicani, the Roman tax collectors that are being discussed here, were so notorious was because they paid the empire up front, and then they were expected to make the profit up from the population. Rome explicitly expected the publicani to strong-arm and extort. Thank you, Bill. That's very interesting. And it would happen, and I mean, I gotta say, I guess I won't slander the country that I'm gonna talk about, but there's a third world country that I was once, visiting for a month, let's say, and the system in a city in that country was that the cops are all corrupt, and they're just sort of waiting on street corners with odd laws that they're meant to enforce. And if you roll through and there's no stop sign there, but then they stop you and say, there was a stop sign. You're like, there's no stop sign. Oh, well, the stop sign is normally there. If you didn't see it, that's your problem, Okay, and then you understand what the system is. So you pay a fine right there on the spot to this cop. I mean, it's a totally corrupt system. You got to give him cash. It's such a corrupt system that cop needs to get cash from the people who roll through that corner so that he can in turn bribe his sergeant, right? His sergeant needs to receive the bribes from the beat cops that work for him so that he can in turn bribe his lieutenant. And it's a corruption that has just permeated the whole system. We live in America, or if you live in America or in a country where this is not the case, it's something to be really thankful for, that you can count, on the police to be enforcing the laws without corruption. That's a blessing. And for sure, the whole world doesn't function that way. I don't even know how if you break it down, do the majority of the countries of the world have corruption-free or generally corruption-free police? Obviously, there's corruption at all levels here and there. But if you're talking about an endemic system like Bill is describing, these tax collectors in Rome, if you don't live in a country that has that kind of endemic corruption, it's something to be thankful for. It really is. Okay, and I'm seeing other questions. So that is it. And Lynn Jobs says, never thought I would be so grateful for the modern IRS in the U.S. But we are lucky to have a system that is generally free of corruption. Very lucky. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. Tomorrow, with God's help, we'll continue page 79. And we're going to discuss a little bit more about these financial matters in the case of somebody who borrowed money and then the loan document either was given back to him or remained in the possession of the lender. And that's getting very interesting because when we talk about these matters of minimum measures to become liable to bring a sin offering, I mean, when you think about this, right, why are these rules being given? Like, no one's going to know what little piece of paper is in your pocket. This is not for a court to enforce. This is for people of faith to know whether they made a mistake that rises to the level where they would motivate themselves to bring that sin offering when the temple is standing. Now, we study these laws, but we want to understand, did we make a mistake where we would want to, pray for forgiveness and to make an atonement. When we start talking about loan documents, now we're talking about matters that need to be enforceable in a court of law because we're regulating not the relationship between a person and God, but the relationships between people and people. And so it's going to be very interesting that these legal matters that regulate between people and people are going to have an importance and something to say in matters relating to the relationship between a person and God. And we'll continue that discussion with God's help tomorrow. All the best, my holy brothers and sisters. May you have a good week.